One morning in mid-June 1973, the streets of New York were about to learn what control really felt like. Behind closed doors, the Gambino crime family was writing scenes straight out of a horror movie, crafting the art not just eliminating bodies of their victims, but dismantling them and making them disappear forever. This was only a small glimpse into the control they would wield over the city. This is the untold story of the rise of the Gambino family and their decades-long grip on New York's criminal world. But before everything else, we need to set the stage for how the Gambino crime family rose to become one of the most notorious crime families in New York. That calls for us to go back to the time of the late 1920s and early 1930s. This was a defining era for New York's underworld, characterized by extensive violence. It was a time when bootlegging, widespread corruption, and ethnic gangs all vied for control of opportunity in the Prohibition-era city. During this period, underworld power was largely fragmented, with mob bosses like Joe Masseria and Salvatore Maranzano leading rival factions. Each of these gangs was desperate to dominate the growing network of speakeasies, smuggling routes, and illicit protection rackets. Within a short time, the rivalry between Masseria and Maranzano's factions had escalated into the savage conflict that came to be known as the Castellamarese War between February 1930 and April 1931. This period was marked by a series of betrayals among factions and individuals, hits, and shifting alliances, all in an effort to capitalize on the scarce opportunities that presented themselves within New York's underworld. Then came the climax in 1931. This was when Masseria was assassinated in a move orchestrated by the younger faction, led by Lucky Luciano. His death left a vacuum, and with it, an opportunity to reshape organized crime in America. Initially, Masseria's biggest rival, Maranzano, attempted to impose order by declaring himself boss of all bosses. Regardless, his reign was brief, as Luciano had a wild card up his sleeve. On September 10, 1931, ordered a hit on Maranzano. It happened that on that day, he was lured to his office in Manhattan under the pretense of a meeting. There, a team of gunmen entered his office and shot him multiple times. With him out of the picture, Luciano assumed the leadership role. He would go on to create something far more structured. We're talking about a governing council of Maffia families, the foundation of the modern criminal system in New York. It is this structure that also led to the birth of what would become known as the Five Families, each with defined territories, leadership hierarchies, and a code that allowed mobsters to expand operations without wiping each other out. Among the Five Families was one that would later adopt the name Gambino. Yet before it ever entered headlines, the family traced its roots to older crime groups, originally under mafiosi such as Salvatore D'Aquila. But one thing had curtailed its growth during that time. The operating environment was largely messy and often ethnic neighborhood-based. However, with the new structure under Lucky's leadership, things were about to change, quickly. Enter Vincent Mangiano, the guy entrusted with leadership between the early 1930s and 1940s. Under him, the group controlled waterfront rackets, from union influence, extortion, trucking, and even illegal gambling. Its influence spread through docks and longshore unions that steered much of New York's shipping and construction industries. Slowly but surely, the group was laying the foundation for what would become a long-running era of dominance and bloodshed. However, Mangiano's era was largely violent, unstable, and ruthless, and he would later be replaced by Albert Anastasia, the feared hitman and head of a notorious murder-for-hire squad known publicly as Murder Inc. Under his brutal regime, the group seemed to morph from a business-focused network to a terror machine. It was so vicious that it even drove fear through rival gangs and law enforcement alike. The Mafia might have had its foundation based on tradition, but as time went by, it proved that it no longer lived by old-world romanticism. It had now adopted a violent efficiency and raw power, the only language some understood. Then came October 25, 1957, a chilly day when everything changed. As Albert Anastasia was entering the barbershop of the Park Sheridan Hotel in Midtown Manhattan, he was shot and killed by two gunmen. It later turned out that the assassination was orchestrated by rival mobster Vito Genovese and Anastasia's underboss, Carlo Gambino, a Palermo-born immigrant who had risen steadily through the ranks. But the vacuum left by Anastasia would not go for long before being filled. And who better to fill it than Carlo Gambino? He was known for his calm demeanor and almost invisible public presence, a a sharp contrast from his predecessor's brutality and loud personality. Rather than resort to violence, Gambino chose bribery, alliances, infiltration, and subtle control. With him at the helm, the family rebranded to the Gambino crime family, and with that, a new era of power. Within a short time, Gambino proved to be more than just an ordinary mob boss. He seemed to earn the title that Maranzano had yearned for, the boss of bosses. He mastered the art of expanding his influence not through chaos, but through business-like precision. His interests extended across gambling rings, union control, shipping, construction, garment trucking, and more. And on top of all that, he managed to interweave them into New York's legitimate economy. It is under his rule that the Gambino family evolved from old-school dock and union rackets to a sophisticated crime syndicate that could bribe, manipulate, and exert influence in boardrooms just as easily as back alleys. While rival gangs settled scores in public through violence, this family had adopted a strategy that made them harder to prosecute and far more dangerous. And as 1957 turned into 1958, the newly christened Gambino crime family stood at the center of a transformation. It was clear that the era of gangland overt violence was giving way to a new model, an era where power was hidden behind corporate facades, where tenements and union halls replaced speakeasies, and where bricks of concrete hid more than just steel inside them. This was the calm before the storm. And soon, those quiet moves made by the Gambino crime family would shake the foundations of New York's underworld in ways no open kill shot ever could. The late 1950s were a period when New York City was busy rebuilding after World War II. While other gangs held on to the legacy way of doing things, Carlo Gambino saw an opportunity that would set his family aside from others. It was an opportunity that seemed respectable on the surface. He knew that venturing into businesses that were doing well at that time would provide a way for the family to mask their illegal activities. And that's how the Gambino family got into construction, trucking, waste disposal, unions, and gambling. Aside from offering recurring revenue, these sectors were not under the continuous radar of the federal authorities, and more importantly, they promised steady streams of cash flow, a resource that the family needed in large quantities if it was to sustain its operational model. As such, the family would go on an aggressive spree of bribing or intimidating union leaders and installing its own men in leadership roles. It would then use worker benefit funds and pension plans as vehicles for money laundering, extortion, and skimming. Case in point is Anthony Anastasio, a Gambino-affiliated figure who by the 1950s and 1960s controlled Brooklyn's ILA Local 1814 and held a vice presidential role in the International Longshoremen's Association. Through Anastasio's leadership, the family was firmly in control of waterfront labor and could also extort shipping companies and skim union from union benefit funds and pension plans. With Gambino's puppets such as Anastasio right at the center of these unions, the family could pull strings and ensure things went its way. From threatening slowdowns, strikes, or labor unrest, the family found an effective way of demanding payments under the guise of labor peace. This often felt like a dagger right into the heart of contractors and developers that needed timely work. Yet they had no option but to do as the Gambino family wanted. Imagine a single family being so influential that a project could not start without their nod and a contract cannot close without their cut. With the unions firmly under the family's control, the next area of focus turned out to be the lucrative New York's concrete and cement market. Here, the family handpicked a cartel of contractors whose responsibility was to handle major projects citywide. The cartel would later come to be known as the Concrete Club. Under this scheme, any project whose value was anywhere between $2 and $15 million had to be given to a member of the Concrete Club. This meant that outside contractors were effectively locked out of these lucrative projects. In return, the members of the Concrete Club had to kick back approximately 2% of the value of the contract to the family's hierarchy. And it was not just private projects. The family's control of the concrete market extended even to public roads, bridges, and other public amenities. And because Gambino had managed to embed the structure so extensively, developers and contractors were left with no choice but to pay the fee, as refusal meant sabotage, intimidation, or in some cases, worse. It is this level of control that meant the Gambinos somehow decided who built what, where, and on what terms. Needless to say, with unions and construction under its sway, the Gambino family needed ways to clean and legitimize the massive profits. The solution? Front companies, shell corporations, subcontractors, and controlled union benefit boards. This made it easier for the family to inflate contracts and pad invoices. It also sent invoices and collected funds for work that was either barely done by non-union workers, or even not done at all. The funds would then flow through shell firms and union pension and benefit accounts before being reinvested back into legitimate sectors such as real estate, suppliers, and trucking companies. Investigations would also later reveal that the family installed some figures into nominal positions in unions or companies and wrote them paychecks despite no evidence of them doing any work. With that move, the Gambinos had graduated from being mere street-level thugs to corporate magnates. And that was just the beginning of their rise to the helm of New York's criminal world. In all of these, Carlo Gambino was well aware of one fact. The survival of this criminal empire was guaranteed as long as a strict code of secrecy, loyalty, and silent enforcement was followed. With that, he introduced the code of omerta, silence about business in exchange for protection. Simply put, as long as members kept their mouths shut about the family's activities, they did not have to worry about brutal consequences. In fact, majority of the members that violated this code did not live to narrate their ordeals, as they suffered brutal deaths, especially under the hands of a Gambino-affiliated killer known as Roy DeMeo. However, we shall come back to that later, so make sure you stick till the end as we will reveal the horrific ways through which those that broke the omerta code were dealt with by the Gambinos. The family had also adopted a hierarchy with capos, underbosses, soldiers, and associates, with each of these having clearly defined responsibilities. The work of capos was to manage crews and oversee union infiltration or racket assignments. On the other hand, soldiers were responsible for enforcing discipline and carrying out any other form of enforcement whenever a need arose. The associates and frontmen were tasked with handling the legit side of the family's businesses, including the company's paperwork and subcontracting. It is this structure right here that allowed the family to operate almost like a fully fledged corporation, with investment, management, human resources, and enforcement departments. Everyone fully understood their roles and the subsequent consequences if they failed to perform their duties. In a few years, Carlo Gambino had managed to turn this family from just another ordinary crime family to a well-oiled crime machine that even seasoned investigators had a hard time investigating. But by the late 1970s and early 1980s, age was quickly catching up with Carlo Gambino. At the same time, he was now more focused on maintaining stability rather than expanding through overt street violence. With that, it was time for a new blood to take over the reins of the crime family, and that is how Paul Castellano found himself as the new boss, having risen within the Gambino ranks. He was a man with a business demeanor, not a street soldier's swagger. That explains why under him, the family's focus shifted even more toward the white-collar empire side. Yet Carlo did not step away completely. He remained the official head of the family until his death from a heart attack on October 15, 1976, in his Upper East Side apartment. Castellano went further and appointed his son, Philip Castellano, as president of Scaramix Concrete Corporation. This was a Staten Island-based concrete company that under Gambino influence reportedly secured a near monopoly on ready-mix concrete supply in that borough. Then there were capos like Thomas Bellotti and Gene Gotti, quietly managed construction kickbacks and union infiltration. For traditional mobsters such as John Gotti, Frank DeChico, Angelo Ruggiero, and Gene Gotti, this approach by Castellano was unwelcome. You see, these guys were adamant that influence in the underworld was measured in fear and reputation, not by quiet infiltration into the business world and profit margins. They plainly showed resentment toward an approach that saw boardrooms replace alleys, contracts replace territory, and payoffs replace intimidation. Not even the lucrative ventures such as the Concrete Club could make them change their mind. All these felt like a betrayal to those who still believed in brute force and violence as the ultimate measures to enforce loyalty and reaffirm control. At first, the tensions were subtle, nothing that Castellano could not handle. But as time went by, the cracks widened further and ambitions started clashing. And with that, the stage was set. With one side wielding fists and the other wielding legit-looking business practices, the fault lines of power threatened to explode into a confrontation that would redefine the Gambino dynasty forever. But before we get deeper into the story, now is the perfect time for you to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on any future upload that we make. Thank you, and back to the story. By December 16, 1985, the rivalry had reached boiling point and was about to explode. On the 16th of that month, as dusk settled on Manhattan, Castellano and his underboss Thomas Bellotti climbed out of a limo outside Sparks Steakhouse. This was a routine meeting with nothing worth raising suspicion, Yet what unfolded moments would shake New York and rewrite the entire history of organized crime in the city and throughout the US. At about 5:30 p.m., a hit squad dressed in long coats and fur hats burst from the shadows. Gunfire erupted, and in the chaos, Castellano was hit by 5 bullets on his head and chest, killing him almost instantly. His underboss, Thomas Bellotti, who was exiting the car at the same time, was hit multiple times in the chest, also fatally. In just a few seconds, 2 men were down, and the assailants were nowhere to be seen. What happened right there was bold and audacious, a direct slaying of a Maffia head in the heart of Manhattan, and even worse, in broad daylight. Meanwhile, John Gotti, one of the old-school mobsters that had expressed dissatisfaction at Castellano's leadership approach, and his lieutenant Salvatore Gravano, sat in a sedan across the street, watching the carnage. Their plan had succeeded. Within days, Gotti would be proclaimed as the new boss of the Gambino family. With Castellano out of the way, the path to the top of the Gambino family's hierarchy was clear, and that is how John Gotti seized control. With that, the era of Wall Street-style management was over, and in came flashiness, visible power, and headline-grabbing violence. Unlike the family's founder, Carlo, Gotti embraced the limelight and styled himself as a modern mob king, earning the nickname the Dapper Don. Gotti did not waste time in taking the family back to the traditional ways of making money, including gambling, extortion, union deals, and street crimes. But there was a catch. With Gotti's leadership style, law enforcement found it easier to pick up traces and piece together the pieces of the crime family's puzzle. His brash moves also saw him make more enemies both within and outside the family. One of the most notable incidents where he capitalized on violence as a management tool came in 1986, when he ordered the execution of Robert D.B. DiBernardo, a high-ranking capo whose only real crime was being perceived as a threat. Something as simple as paranoia was enough for him to order a quiet bullet to the head. To him, that was what it took to remind everyone who ran the family now. Then, in 1990, he signed off on the murder of Louis De Bono, which would later be carried out inside a World Trade Center parking garage. The reason? De Bono had shown disrespect. Earlier on, Gotti had sought to cement his position with the brazen killing of James McBratney, whom he gunned down in a Staten Island bar while disguised as a police officer. Even when John Favara, a neighbor that had accidentally killed Gotti's son, vanished overnight, everyone understood the unspoken message. Crossing Gotti could mean finding permanent residence 6 feet under. Do you remember Roy DeMeo? It was alleged that he was hired severally by John Gotti to murder some of his victims. According to witness accounts, some of the scenes were so gory as DeMeo often used dismemberment as a tool to dispose off a body. He would chop off a body into 6 parts and dump each package in a different place. By the late 1980s, John Gotti had taken the Gambino family to a level where it looked unstoppable from the outside. With an inflated ego and a larger-than-life attitude, he would strut through New York like a king who believed the throne was welded beneath him. Cameras flashed, crowds gathered, reporters hung on every smile. But behind that confidence was a legal storm quietly gathering speed, one unlike anything the Maffia had ever faced. You see, it all began with a law few mob bosses took seriously, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, popularly known as RICO. Although this law had been introduced in 1970, it seemed to stay dormant, and it was not until the 1980s when the government started weaponizing it. It was a single statute that flipped the entire game with the blink of an eye. With it in place, prosecutors no longer had to prove one murder, one extortion, or one loan sharking scheme. Instead, they could now stitch together patterns such as conversations, payments, and orders, and use that to hold the entire leadership of a criminal organization accountable. For a crime family such as the Gambinos, RICO was a slow-moving earthquake. And Gotti, who reveled in attention, never thought twice about tying loose ends, and who believed loyalty was unbreakable, never noticed that the ground beneath him was shifting. Quick. By now, the FBI had managed to gather substantial evidence against Gotti and the Gambino family, including hours of wiretap recordings from the Ravenite Social Club, Gotti's headquarters in Little Italy. But they knew one thing. They needed something that would position Gotti right at the center of this crime family. And to have that, they needed a voice from inside the inner circle. But who would agree to what was an outright suicide mission? Against all odds, that voice was none other than Salvatore "Sammy the Bull" Gravano, Gotti's own underboss. As well as one of the most feared men in the Underworld, this was not just another insider. He had been the one enforcing discipline, smoothing disputes. As he later admitted, he had also participated in 19 murders. The FBI were equally shocked. This was the last person anyone imagined switching sides. You might ask, how did the FBI manage to make Gravano betray his boss? Well, do you remember the tapes we have mentioned just a short while ago? It turned out they contained audio evidence of Gotti blaming Gravano for murders that he himself had ordered. He mocked him, diminished him, and overall treated him as expendable. The moment Gravano heard the tapes, he cracked, and in 1991, he agreed to cooperate, a move that shuttered New York's underworld. Men in the organization later said that when the news broke, it felt like the ground dropped. Inside the courtroom, the suspense was suffocating. Prosecutors pressed play on the Ravenite tapes. Crackling audio captured Gotti discussing hits, strategy, and internal discipline. Gravano then took the stand and pulled back the curtain on decades of Gambino's secrets. He left nothing behind, from the Castellano assassination, the family's extortion rackets, and the names of capos, soldiers, and associates. Nothing was off limits. Jurors listened in frozen silence as Gravano relayed the mechanics of Gambino power with utmost accuracy. Every confession chipped away at the Empire's armor, and the same swagger that had once made Gotti a folk hero now made him look reckless, careless, and fatally exposed. Then, on April 2, 1992, the verdict dropped. John Gotti was guilty on all counts: murder, racketeering, and conspiracy. The sentence? Life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, along with a $250,000 fine. He was immediately sent to a high-security federal prison in Marion, Illinois, a facility considered among the most secure in the U.S. You'd be forgiven to think that the Gambino crime family immediately crumbled with the conviction of John Gotti, yet far from that, it seemed to dissolve in slow motion. After the government was done with John Gotti, it went for other influential figures such as Frank Locascio, Thomas Huck Carbonaro, Anthony Fat Andy Reggiano, and Louis Valerio. Others, such as Nicholas Caruso, were forced into hiding as indictments circled. For nearly 2 years, he remained a fugitive and managed to quietly move through safe houses within New York and Florida. He would later be arrested, after which he pleaded guilty to racketeering charges tied to gambling and extortion. But the arrests were only half the story. The real implosion would later come from within. We've already mentioned Gravano, who flipped on his boss. Then came others like Michael Mikey Scars de Leonardo, a trusted Gotti loyalist who revealed the family's financial skeleton. Other notable names among those that defected are Dominic Fat Don Borghese, who laid out the operations of Brooklyn Cruise, and Frank Fabiano, Edward Garofalo, and Salvatore Sammy Meatballs Avena, all of whom peeled back layers of loan sharking, extortion, and union rackets. Some defectors formed entirely new lives under the Witness Protection Program. This meant that they were handed opportunities to adopt new identities and leave their old worlds behind. Others joined a growing web of federal cooperators who, knowingly or not, created a new shadow family of informants, each one feeding the government a steady drip of intel. A few even tried to launch legitimate businesses after testifying, though many struggled, haunted by the paranoia of revenge. And then there were the crews that tried to survive the collapse. After Gravano flipped, his Arizona-based followers went ahead and formed what they called the Southwest Street Crew. This was essentially a gang that attempted to build their own meth-dealing operation until the FBI crushed it. Meanwhile, offshoots from Brooklyn and Staten Island reorganized into loosely connected micro-crews, abandoning the old centralized structure. These groups operated more like independent cells than a single family. Some of them stuck to gambling rings, while others moved into credit card fraud, cyber scams, and quiet rackets that kept them under the radar. So, is the Gambino family still active today? To answer that, we have to go back to the early 2000s when Nicholas Caruso walked out of prison. During that time, the Gambino family was a hollowed-out version of its former self, fragmented, confused, and desperate for stability. But when Caruso returned, he joined hands with Peter Gotti and Arnold Squitieri to rewire the family and bring it back to life. But power in the mob never stays unchallenged for long. In February 2008, before dawn broke across New York, federal agents launched Operation Old Bridge, a sweeping multi-family strike aimed straight at the Gambino hierarchy. And this time, Caruso had no warning, no safe house, and no escape route. Prosecutors accused him of greenlighting the 1996 double murder of Richard Godkin and John Gebert, shaking down construction firms, running massive loan sharking networks, and even keeping ties to international traffickers. Cornered, he pleaded guilty and went back behind bars for 13.5 years. He would later walk free in 2020, this time silent and nearly invisible. Yet even today, law enforcement still stumbles upon traces of the family's criminal DNA. Evidently, this triggers the question, did the family really die out, Or are Caruso and his colleagues simply waiting for the right moment to move again? Let us know your thoughts, and remember to subscribe to the channel for more videos like this.